What a year! I don't recall there being another year where there have been as many game releases I was excited about as this one. There was Corn, Stray, Neon White, Songs of Conquest, Garage Remake came to Steam, as well as The Eternal Cylinder. Fear and Hunger 2 Termina came out while I'm writing this. I'm already broke after buying all that goodness. I have my hands full, and the year just keeps on giving. I'm probably forgetting some, but the list goes on. And now, there's Burhouse Lane, the new title from Harvester Games. If that doesn't ring a bell, many people, me included, tend to introduce Burhouse Lane as the new game from the Cat Lady developer. Must be a little annoying having one of his older titles overshadow whatever came after, but it was just that good. It certainly feels a bit odd for myself to make a review type video for this game, since I had done Let's Plays for all the other ones. Well, the original version of Downfall excluding. But it might be fitting, because if my memory serves me right, the Cat Lady, Downfall, and Lorelei were supposed to be a trilogy called The Devil Came Through Here. And it did feel like it got some closure with the ending of Lorelei, so Burhouse Lane might be something different entirely. Unsurprisingly though, Burhouse Lane is very much more of the same. A horror side-scroller about suicidally depressed British people doing horrible things and finding happiness in life afterwards. As much as the UK is a fitting setting for suicidal depressed protagonist, isn't the developer Polish? Poland would be an excellent setting for something like that too, just look at Darkwood. Anyway, the general premise of Burhouse Lane is quite a lot like the one of the Cat Lady. A lonely woman attempts to take her life, fails, and gets a second chance at life, but has to deal with some very bad people before that can happen. When I put it like that, it almost feels like Burhouse Lane is more like a different retelling of the Cat Lady rather than a successor, and it kinda makes sense to try to chase that clout again. I really want to treat Burhouse Lane as its own separate thing, but as a fan of the developer, I really struggle not to compare the game to its predecessors. The first game I had experience out of these was the Cat Lady, and it made me fall in love with it. The writing in it was pretty great. I really loved the protagonist. A suicidal depressed middle-aged woman is far from who I am in real life, but I somehow found her, and her done with everything attitude, incredibly relatable. The whole story had a neat surreal spin, fueled by an unreliable narrator. And the presentation? Oh boy. The visuals might have been a bit rough, but they were stylish as hell. The game was nearly black and white, with only some sequences receiving some unnatural lighting or colorful highlights. The odd collage style looked very grungy, and the moment I saw it, I thought to myself that if I were to make a similar game, I would have made it looking like this even before I was aware of the Cat Lady. It just clicked with me. The soundtrack was great too. Then, Downfall was even more stylized, being fully black and white, with only bloody red elements being colored in. It was a fitting choice when the game resembled a slasher flick more. Lorelei? It was still great, but the young adult drama in that one didn't grip me quite as much. It was the most recent one I played, but I can already barely remember the plot. It was a cool transition between engines though, even if the game was a bit shorter and easier. The previous games were made using Adventure Game Studio, and having that in mind, they looked incredible for that fairly limited engine. Lorelei was the first one made in Unity, and that allowed for a high resolution, dynamic lighting, and actual 3D elements. The game looked as good as ever. Now, Burhouse Lane combines the technical experience and attempts to replicate that Cat Lady's magic, and you know what? It does pretty damn well. I must admit, I was a little skeptical at first, since the character designs this time around look a bit uncanny to me with this pretty realistic art style, but still being very stiff otherwise. Also, with these games being pretty similar to one another, things get predictable over time. the cat lady had the benefit of surprise. The whole game felt very surreal, not being able to tell what's real and what's not. But with more titles it became apparent that more people experience similar supernatural events, taking away some of the mystery. The mind-bending surreal elements became sort of a staple, and by this point I knew exactly what to expect. But Burhouse Lane still won me over. This time, the game made me take control of Angie Weather, a lonely nurse who had been briefly married to one of her terminally sick patients, knowing full well that the happiness wouldn't last. Seems a bit dumb thinking rationally, but you can't command your heart. To me, it immediately made her feel pretty human. Shortly after her husband's passing, she was diagnosed with the same terminal lung cancer. Not knowing how to continue the little life she has left, and after a tough opening scene of a failed suicide attempt, she accepts one last job, to look after an elderly gentleman in a remote village. I honestly expected George to be one of those stereotypical grumpy old farts, a general nuisance, but he turned out to be such a sweetheart. I love him. Getting settled in George's house and exploring the premises, Angie finds a weird passage through the basement and gets to the Burhouse Lane, the sort of an apocalyptic alternate realm of the dead and near dead. It's sort of like those myths about terminally sick people being in tune with the dead and being able to see their spirits. Aside from all sorts of doo-doo, she encounters this enormous kitty, which is sort of like this game's equivalent of the Queen of Maggots, since she's... The kitty is way nicer than that witch, but in exchange for curing Angie of cancer, he is still asked to do multiple tasks. And this is where the classic hunt of the paranormal serial killers begins. All this was within chapter 1, so I don't consider it too spoilery yet, but since this game is very story heavy, I'll keep the rest of the story discussion for the spoiler section. Let's talk presentation a little, shall we? This is technically the nicest looking title from Harvester Games so far. Most of the grunge is gone, but the game is a beauty to look at. The slightly uncanny characters aside, a lot of frames in it make for great wallpaper material. After messing around with game development myself, I can really appreciate the use of post-processing effects in this game. The lighting looks great, especially for a mostly 2D game. Also, considering that Burhouse Lane is a horror game, it's incredibly colorful, utilizing a highly varied color palette. There might be peaceful, rose-tinted morning scenes, or ones that look way drab and desaturated. The more intense and surreal sections would get dominated by deep red fog. The Burhouse Lane itself always looks great. I also love this creepy forest section. Speaking of great looking things, oh that me! Now that's how you make a face reveal. I guess I'm a canon character in the series now. The photos are a bit aged at this point though. I'm a fair bit more beardy now. But it's still me, in my inferior form. The game also sounds pretty great. Not that many music tracks were all that memorable, but they were a great fit, building the atmosphere. I found the use of sound effects pretty great too, and the sound design overall was impressive, pretty seamless and naturally fitting. The one issue I had is that some stuff would be louder than it should. Not even in a way how some games would have poorly mixed audio, with some sound effects being louder than everything else or whatever, not at all. But there would be a lot of sounds that would be clipping into 0 dB, even if I lower the volume. The game could really use some sort of a limiter just to prevent that. There would be some clipping or pops in some of the voice acting, but that's fairly minor issue considering a good bit of the cast aren't real professionals. I don't want to point fingers, but in some cases it shows, with some voice acting feeling a bit deadpan or not quite appropriately toned for the situation, but some of the cast were just outstanding, like Angie, our protagonist, Old Man George, or Kieran. Actually, Kieran reminds me a good bit of Scottish version of Airsoft Fatty. What a lad. Speaking of things that remind me of other things, there are references aplenty in this game. But they're used quite tastefully, never being obnoxiously in your face. There would be some overall genre cliches, like being chased by a satanic murderer in the woods, exploring an abandoned asylum, or being trapped in a cannibal's house. But sometimes, the expectations that come with those cliches would be cleverly subverted. Other than that, there would be things like a random kid looking like the one from It, or... I'm actually not even sure if this is an intended reference, but these two detectives look a fair bit like Scully and Mulder from the X-Files. Also remember Kill Corn from Sniper? This game has Hell's Porn Flakes. If you ever played any games from The Devil Came Through Here series, there isn't much to talk about when it comes to the gameplay, as it's almost exactly the same. These games have the same logic as classic point and clicks, having the player solve problems by going back and forth, looking for useful items and chatting to people, except instead of having to point and click, the character moves using keyboard or controller input. It avoids the common issue of being a kleptomaniac simulator too. You only get to pick up items when you logically know that they would be useful, instead of having to go through moon logic puzzles. However surreal the storytelling is in this game, the puzzles make a lot of sense and I never felt actually stuck, even in trickier bits. While the game is not combat focused whatsoever, there's more actual combat in Burhouse Lane than in any of the predecessors. It's very simplistic, especially considering that in most cases you can only move in one axis, but it's good for building tension and giving the player more agency instead of making every action scene a cutscene. Some of the boss encounters actually push the simplistic combat system pretty far, making the fight actually interesting. I was also surprised at the amount of platforming in Burhouse Lane. It makes sense with it being a side-scroller, but it's not quite common for platformers to have dark, serious stories. Remember that scene in The Cat Lady where you briefly get to control a cat? There's plenty of that here. Secret cat game review! The cat's animations are only a bit less awkward than the ones in The Cat Lady, but the platforming sections break up the pace rather nicely, and the cat is absolutely adorable. And yes, you can pet the cat in this game. Game is officially good. In the short moments of peace, Angie still needs to do her job and make sandwiches for George. There's a whole recurring minigame for that, and there are many possible sandwich recipes to discover. It feels like such a silly mechanic, but somehow it's just great. Except for the fact that any sandwiches I'd make for myself in real life are considered weird in this game. To be fair, I do make weird sandwiches though. I'll share a recipe of the most infamous one that I call the killer sandwich. First, you need black bread. Best if it's home baked by an Eastern European granny. That kind of bread is so dense and coarse, it can easily choke you to death on its own. For binding, butter is classic, but you can also use cheese spread or garlic sauce. For meat you need something cured. I recommend sausage. I love cured hams, but they're more chewy and might make the whole thing impossible to eat. Then I like to eat spicy, so I add jalapenos. Then add cheese. If you want to add some crunch, you can choose between pickles, radishes, or spring onions. After all those nasty layers, add another slice of that black bread on top for good measure. It's an actual killer sandwich after all, not some mere choke me harder daddy sandwich. Good luck surviving that. Can't lie, I have encountered quite a few bugs in the game. Some of them would even require me to reload the game in order to proceed, but some would be hilariously terrifying, like this mannequin randomly following me everywhere I go. I was playing straight at launch though, and the issue seemed to be getting ironed out rather quickly, so given a bit of time I'm sure the game will be a lot smoother to play. Still waiting for that washing hands after bathroom update. Like in the rest of these games, there are also some choices to make, whether in dialogues or outside them, and that determines the game's ending. That's enforced with there only being a single save slot. If you fuck up, you fuck up. There's no going back, unless you maniacally back up save files that is. I'd say no matter the outcome, the story is still interesting, and I got invested enough to go and see every ending for myself. But if you want the best one, you might need to replay the whole thing. At least, after messing up, it's fairly clear what you can do to make things better. Speaking of choices and outcomes, I think it's time for a brief spoiler discussion. I recommend supporting the developer and playing the game for yourself, but if you want my take on what transpires in the game, you can listen to me ramble until this time. The story of Burhouse Lane is a very human one. Like always with Harvester games, it's more of a personal drama, focused on trauma, mental issues and relationships. Yet at the same time, the game would be wearing a badass coat of blood, gore and twisted scenarios. In comparison to the cat lady Susan, who for the most part just wants to be left alone and end her life, slowly learning to enjoy things once again throughout the game, Angie in Burhouse Lane is a bit more simple of a character, personality-wise, but no less deep. In contrast to Susan, Angie desperately wants to live. It's just that she lost hope in life after not having any close people and getting diagnosed with a terminal cancer. After her failed suicide attempt, she accepts one last job as means to raise some money for a trip to Japan, which her husband and she dreamt about. Even in death, she's still chasing dreams. Yet that leads her to get stuck in a dead-end village, caring for a grandpa, instead of having fun crossing things off some sort of a bucket list. Her hope sparks again when she gets to the Burhouse Lane for the first time and gets offered an opportunity to cure her sickness. The catch is that she would have to do several tasks, all of which involve something morbid and immoral. Angie, however, is no superhero. She does not have immortality like Susan, she's just a regular woman. A nurse at that, someone who helps people get better by craft. Someone who's using empathy as one of the main tools in their arsenal. Or at least they should. Healthcare workers can be a total joke sometimes. Either way, she's far from desensitized to the horrors. But she's willing to go through them, if that means she can continue living. Without spoiling too much, I want to say that some of the most impactful encounters are not the ones with monsters or murderers, but the ones with regular people in Angie's life. George, Kieran, Jenny and others. There's the struggle of getting to know new people and opening up to strangers. The struggle of not knowing whether the person can be trusted with deeper feelings. Arguments may arise, but one must remember that the way to solve arguments is through empathy, by talking them through. Everyone says some things they don't mean, and patience is needed, even when life for oneself feels completely unfair. Since I mentioned Jenny, she mentions in-game that she's a famous actress and I just had to Google her name to make sure there's no reference I'm missing. Jenny Wild. Oh, the results sure are wild. There's even some visual likeness. The dev implies that it's unintentional, but I wouldn't be so sure after Hell's Porn Flakes. Jokes aside, throughout the game these strangers on the farm become actual friends. The only friends Angie really has, and that makes the final chapter even tougher. As a cure, Jenny receives a cursed cigarette that would transfer her sickness to whoever smokes it. But it's near impossible to choose someone without having to live in constant guilt. George seems old already, but he's the nicest person you can hope to find. Jenny tends to act like a cold bitch, but Angie has seen her better side, and the bitchiness is mostly due to Jenny suffering from drug withdrawal symptoms. Everyone's a human, with an equal right to live, and after solving problems through empathy and getting close to people, such a decision seems impossible. Is it really worth it to sacrifice someone else just because you've been through a lot of terrible stuff? The build up to this final dilemma was pretty great too. By the end of the game, I felt like I cared for most of the main cast. All of them felt like actual believable people. Even the whole smoking thing is used cleverly in the game. Angie is suffering from lung cancer, yet the saving mechanic is literally smoking, and you have to do that constantly. Of course, at this point it doesn't matter to Angie anymore, but gotta appreciate the irony. The game even has one of those old-time morals at the end. Smoking fucking sucks. I only have one gripe with the plot itself, and it's one of the main events in the story. Big spoiler, but there's a secret drug lab under George's house, and that's where the big finale happens. It's hinted throughout the game that it might be the case, but just the existence of the drug lab makes little sense to me. Apparently George's former nurse, whom Angie is filling in for, used to secretly make drugs in George's basement. That alone sounds believable, except that the drug lab is on another level below the regular basement and protected by a hidden and heavily armored door. And it's no broom closet, it's an entire new floor of the house with multiple large rooms. How the second basement was kept a secret from George is a complete mystery to me, because it would require some serious construction work to dig that much space out, make stone walls, and install all the other stuff. Not only would it take long, but it would also be loud. It's not a sequence that comes out of nowhere, but it feels a bit inconsistent even in comparison with all these surreal elements and Angie jumping between different realities. Probably because this twist was supposed to be more grounded in reality and not all psychedelic. Oh, and you also get to meet everyone's favorite striped sweater-clad girl, so Burhouse Lane is a canonical part of the series. I really liked Burhouse Lane. I felt like it pulled off the sensitive personal drama and the gory horror parts equally well. I would get deeply invested into the characters, and the horror segments, where I'd have to hide from killers or fend off monsters, would actually make me feel uneasy. And it all blends into a single story seamlessly, with some neat minigames and puzzle sections to mix up the pace. It's the longest one of these games so far too, and it has quite a bit of replay value. Trying to get the best ending is the most obvious reason to replay the game, but hearing what George's favorite sandwich is towards the end of the game was lucrative enough for me just to make that sweetheart happy. And there's plenty to do for achievement hunters, because it's impossible to unlock everything in a single run. Some of the horror segments would sometimes feel a bit detached from the main plot, hence why I talked about them less, but they're sort of like a tool for character development and interactions. The game can be horrid, as a horror game should, but it's even more touching. I guess for some, the big question remains, how does it compare to the Cat Lady? I would say they're about even, and that's a pretty high praise, since the Cat Lady sits among my favorite games list. Zartor is one over the other. I still like some stylistic and story elements better in the Cat Lady, but Burhouse Lane feels more developed as a game. It has some more meat to it. So in the end, that means that I can still consider Burhouse Lane to be one of Harvester Games' best works, and it's more than worth playing through the story about loss, empathy, rediscovering the purpose to live, and kick-ass horror scenes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.